Hi, I'm Paul Jerard, and we're at our Wellness Center today. And what we're going to discuss is the need for adaptive yoga classes. So, years ago, and even now, there are some teachers who believe that students should fit into a cookie cutter mold. A specific type of student is all they want, and maybe they only want Olympic gymnasts. And that's fine as long as they're honest with students ahead of time. And this means you don't put anybody at risk. So if you say Olympic gymnasts only need apply, that will make it a lot more simple for the public. It's a bit standoffish, but I'll put it to you this way, at least you'll keep them safe. They know what they're in for ahead of time. In reality, a lot of us want to have a menu of classes. So we want to have the challenging classes, but we also want to have the classes that are accessible to everyone. So some of the things that go on in some schools shouldn't go on at all. And that is labeling a class correctly and making sure that everyone understands. For example, if they're going to go to a restorative class, that the restorative class basically is a case of ground-based postures where they expect to use gravity for resistance, and it's not going to be a hard pressing class where there's any challenges, and there's not going to be a standing routine. Usually they don't do sun salutations in restorative classes. There are some exceptions, but usually that's not the case. They might do a warm-up. It might be a ground-based warm-up, so it might be kind of slow. I have seen slow sun salutations, believe it or not. I have seen also very slow moon salutations as a warm-up. So, sometimes you get a little bit of a mix. But if you're going to do something like that, it's going to be a little bit different than the typical restorative class, then what you should do is label it in the class description. Let them know that it's going to be an active restorative class. And at the same time, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a little bit of a warm up, and then we'll move into restorative poses. It just goes in your description, and it makes it easier for students so that they understand what they're getting into. On the other end of students, some teachers don't realize it, some teachers do. Now, here's an example. If you're a teacher who worked for everything and your body was not naturally flexible in the beginning, then you know what it's like to struggle. If you're a teacher who somehow or another you were born with a very flexible body, then you don't know what a student who's struggling is going through. You can't, because you can't feel it. And that's not a bad thing. It just means that it's something that we have to work on. As teachers, some of us have to work on an empathy chip. Some of us have to work on having a little passion, or compassion, I should say. So it's one of those things where students who are giving you 100% may not do everything perfect. And that's the reason why we have a lot of modifications. That's the reason why we have a lot of different ways of doing different postures. That's the reason why the chair is a big prop, and it's not just all about props. It's more than that. But knowing how to use them is important in making classes adaptive or accessible. The other thing is that we want to understand that accessible means accessible to everyone. And accessible, a lot of times we might think of in just the physical sense, but years ago, people didn't always think about, or they kind of somehow or another overstepped it or didn't see it, that certain populations of the country were able to go to yoga classes easily, while other populations did not get to go to yoga classes for one reason or another. It could have been expense. It could have been where they're located. It could have been the social dynamic in the class. Not going to get in there and splice and dice every little reason why this happened, but we want to make sure that classes are accessible to everybody in all populations. So that's one of the things where I would say that it's been great, where we've managed to reach out to a large number of neighborhoods, and yoga is actually getting out there. It's everywhere now. And the whole thing is to make sure that what we're doing is we're making classes fun, and we're bringing the rich part of yoga into everyone's life, so that people are not dealing so much with, or I should say they're dealing with it, and that is stress and anxiety, but they have now the tools. So they don't have to, say, for example, be limited to a number of over-the-counter drugs to compensate for sleeping and so on. Now, the biggest challenge with adaptive yoga classes for teachers is that there's education. So teachers expand their knowledge. If a teacher doesn't want to expand their knowledge, I don't really know why they got involved in yoga in the first place, because it seems to be infinite in its expansion. There's not enough lifetimes for me to learn all this stuff. And I would say that's the way it is for all of us. There's just a lot of information. So it keeps all of us busy studying all the time. If somebody went to their first training and then just stopped right there, that's a shame, because you're putting students at risk, but then that's a shame because you can't reach into every population either. So it's one of those things where expanding knowledge is actually a healthy thing, especially as we get older. The last thing, I had kind of touched on this before when I said it's not just about props. It's really not. It's also understanding ways of physically being able to adjust the body. And nowadays, there's less hands-on adjustments. Some places don't even want hands-on adjustments. So it's more, that means that I have to strengthen my cueing game as far as explaining verbal cues, which is fine. But there's also another thing, and that is the skeleton is not a perfectly straight stick figure type thing to work with. It's one of those things where it has its own natural curves, and some of the curves are not so natural and throw us out. And it happens to a lot of people. What I'm going to say is, I start to remember what it's like to see a tree get hit by a hurricane and see the following day that tree is tipped at 45 degrees or tipped even to a sharper angle. And some people would say, let's give up on this tree and let's just cut it down. Somebody else might come along and say, there is a way to work this tree back to where it's completely straight. And I've seen this. You take cloth and then you take rope and you put it around the trunk, and you put a certain amount of resistance and you draw in the opposite direction, so that you're slowly trying to draw the tree from, say, this angle to one day, probably years from now, straight again. I've seen this work with big trees, and I've seen this work with small trees. It works a lot easier with the small trees than it does with the big trees. The human body is basically the same thing in some ways. People think that because they see a skeleton at a workshop and it's a dry, stiff skeleton, that's what you have. You don't have that. You have wet bone, and it can actually be manipulated by you as a teacher or as a student. So it's one of those things where what we start to realize is things don't happen overnight, but if you continually work on the skeleton, it will straighten out or it will improve. So it's one of those things where what I would say to you, as far as on this particular stretch that we've talked about, the need for adaptive yoga classes, there is a need, and it's just a matter of which teachers want to rise up and educate themselves and learn how to work with the populations that traditionally missed out on yoga. So one way or another, whether it was physically, emotionally, or culturally, they missed out on it, and we just want to reach everyone. With that said, I want to wish you all farewell. Namaste.